Okay, so back to outcome evaluation, recognizing the fact that the research groups need to be created ethically. You need to be able to make sure that the groups that you're using to look at your outcomes can be created ethically. If not, an outcome evaluation is not the way to go. And then similarly, kind of like we were talking about evaluation versus research, if the evaluation results can be used, it's okay to conduct an evaluation. If they're not helpful, if they're not being used in the long run, it's a waste of time, quite frankly, waste of time and resources. What it shows is the degree to which the program is having an effect. This is the more basic effect that we're looking for. And it's useful because it tells whether the program is being effective in meeting its goals. And then again, to build on top of that, we've got the impact evaluation. And this is seen as, you know, the top tier of evaluations. This is the one that everybody wants a program to have because it is just, you know, the gold star in the work that an organization is doing. And so the impact evaluation is done either during the operation of an existing program, or it might be at the end of a program, and they want to look at their impact before they move forward. It can be used after the program has established that it's meeting its intended outcomes. I've seen it used without outcome validation. I think it probably could, and I think that's probably why people condense the two. I think it's best if you look at outcomes first, and again, you can do any tweaking and modifying that needs to be done before you move on to looking at the impact. But again, you know, time, money, constraints can cause you to do impact before outcome. And then similarly, the research groups need to be created ethically, and the results really need to be used at the end of the evaluation period. And then what it shows is the degree to which the program meets its ultimate goal. And it's useful because it provides evidence when it comes to policy and when it comes to funding decisions. This is one that some programs never really get to. You know, if you're engaged in an ongoing program as an evaluator, you're most often working in the process and outcome evaluation field. And a lot of times I've seen organizations, when it comes to an impact evaluation, get an outside evaluation firm to come in. That tends to be when they ask an external group to come in and do an evaluation. And I think that helps with the lack of bias, right? When we look at our own data, when we're invested in the data, we can have certain interpretations or, you know, biases. And so they're looking to eliminate that from a third-party evaluation. And like I said, that tends to only be used for impact evaluations. So those are the four main types. The first two, just kind of chunk this in a different way for you. The first two are often used when we're getting started and we're testing for fidelity. And then the last two are when we're testing for the desired effect or impact. Please feel free to make any comments or raise your hand if you have any questions as I'm going. Yeah, Celine.
Thank you. I don't know if I should use the chat for raising my hand or the actual hand, but anyway. For the formative evaluation, I've actually never heard of this one. Could you just give an example of what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, you might know of it as a needs assessment. So, you know, just looking at, yeah, I would say a needs assessment falls in that category. Has anybody else engaged in a formative assessment? Yeah, it really isn't the most common.
Yes, I am. I'm working with NGO in Uganda. They are preparing a proposal for the next round of financial aid provided by Italian Foreign Ministry. And we are collecting information and providing some ideas for veterinary One Health security in in the Karamoja area. So that's basically a formative evaluation.
Yeah, perfect.
For now.
Thank you. All right, great. So moving on, when it comes, I want to just dive in a little bit more and apply this knowledge. So let's take a deeper look at this question making stage. This cycle I'll keep coming back to as we go through class. So when it comes to that questioning stage, this is where we define the program and we formulate the evaluation question before we even look at, what our format of the evaluation will be. So when it comes to defining the program, some questions that you might ask are, what is the program or service to be evaluated? Who is the target population? What are the program activities? And what's the intended impact of the program? And then when we're often it falls under this format. So it can be a wide variety of questions, but if you're at a loss for what to ask, I would recommend using this format. So does blank have an impact or cause a change in blank? So we're specifically looking at those outcome impact evaluation, just to make that clear. And as we're going through the stages of how do we design an evaluation for outcome or impact assessment, what stages do we need to go through? So the first one is making sure we understand what the program is. This is when we refer back to the logic model. This is when we refer back to the theory of change. This is when we look at the process evaluation, if there was one. This is when we look at the formative evaluation, if there was one, to just really get an understanding of what are they doing and why and for whom. And then the question that we're asking is there an impact? So to apply this, what I want you to do and what we will do is I'll have you click on this link. There's about a year ago, a school district outside of Philadelphia, Lower Merion, they wanted to evaluate their special education program. And so the link that will take you to is a document that's a request for proposals. And so what I want you to do is I'll break you into your breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. Hopefully that'll be enough time. And I want you to discuss those questions in your breakout room. So scan the document, it's relatively short. And I want you to be able to answer, what's the program or service that will be evaluated? Who is the target population? What are the program activities? That one's a little bit harder, but if you can get to that question, go for it. What's the intended impact of the program? And then what is the evaluation question? And again, if you're struggling with that evaluation question, just ask the question, does blank have an impact on blank? Any questions about what we're doing? I have multiple reasons for doing this. One is to just get you talking to each other. The other one is to just begin to apply some of the things that we're talking about before we continue on. So I'm going to open up the rooms. I'll give you 10 minutes. I'll give you a 5-minute warning and a 2-minute warning. And then we'll come back and I'll just have you share the answers out before we move on. And don't forget, you can raise your hand when you're in the breakout room if you want me to join your group for any reason. All right, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Courtney, what room were you in? All right. How did I do with timing this time?
Oh, terrible.
Too long or too short?
So our group volunteers to answer question 1 and 2 only.
Can do number 3, and then we're
all right.
Yes, number 3 too.
We'll work through as a class the rest of them. Okay, I was sure that it was too long also, so I'll work on that. All right, so which group wanted to do number 1? What's the program or service to be evaluated?
So continuous supporting education. That's
Yep.
that's the program.
Yep, excellent. And in particular, it's a special education program, right?
Special education.
Yep. Okay, and so who's the target population?
Students with
Students with disabilities.
disabilities.
You got it. And are they in a specific, which students, I guess I would say, with disabilities? Is it in one specific school across the whole district?
Setting.
Public schools.
Excellent. Okay, good. Program activities. Anybody get to that one?
I have a theory. I'm not so sure, but I think the activities are something related to support for learning disabilities, health impairments, autism, etc., etc., etc.
We also we looked at the staff that they listed, and we said the activities would be based on the staff available, so like special education, instructional behavioral aides, psychologists, social workers, related to their programs.
Excellent. Very good.
Can I ask a question? Is the staff like target population because they're also you're examining how effective they are? Or I mean, in program activities, we got evidence-based program and practices to support students with disabilities in public school settings.
Yes. That's a good question. And I should clarify, I'll edit this. The target population is of the program or service. So who is the program or service trying to impact is the question. So that would be the students with disabilities. And then the program activity implementers are those people that you listed. All right, then in terms of the intended impact, I don't think that that's very clear in the document. Did anybody see that in there? To be really clear.
We said to bring the section where it says bring our services into closer alignment with contemporary research.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that that's the goal of the evaluation though, right?
Well, they list more generally support for different, scenarios, learning disabilities, autism, speech. But they are not very clear on the activities, I agree.
They also say like that they want to be ensuring the high quality education and services, but again, that's pretty high level.
Yep, it's a little vague. So that would be something to dig into as we're forming an evaluation of this program, is just to really understand what is your goal. And I think that's a really big question, and they might not even know the answer to it, to be honest with you. I would say, I used to be a special education teacher. I taught for 6 years. I would say the federal government's goal for our students with special needs is to have all of them at grade level, ultimately. I would say that most people who are really grounded will understand that that's not realistic for a portion, at least, of special needs students. And so what is their goal? And for sure, one of them is the highest quality education, right? That's very clear. But beyond that, what is their goal would be an important question to clarify with them. And then the evaluation question. What did you all work out?
How good is the program? How effective is the support given to the students?
Yep. And can you see how important it would be to identify what the impact is? Because how good is it at what? Like making the kids happy, or teaching them the information in the best way that's digestible for them? Like you need to know what that intended impact is. But very good. You did a great job with the information that you had. Anybody else have a different kind of evaluation question? No, sorry. Okay, good. So we'll move on, but we're going to keep revisiting Lower Merion. So we're going to keep building on this. So now that we've identified an evaluation question, and if your group didn't, we can use that one as we move forward. So when it comes to making a cause for a causal relationship, so how I guess we should really identify what the intended impact is. What do we want to say their intended impact is? Maybe giving the best quality education possible.
Also the success rate in certain exams, final outcome of the education.
Okay, good. So good. I would say that's probably not the intended impact, but a way of measuring the intended impact.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Okay, so when we're making the case for that relationship, that the special education services they provide, the impact is the best education possible, right? They're doing the very best they can in their academic career. In order to make that case, we need to have a certain setting in front of us. So this grid is just showing, usually we're talking about a program that we're evaluating. You can see this trajectory. It moves from the time before the program to the time after the program. And we have this upward curve. And you can see that it is in existence, whether there was a program or not. The expectation is in school for the year that we're looking at, or the 5-year, or their entire K through 12 experience, they will be making progress no matter what. The question is, though, does the special education program at Lower Merion have a more profound impact on their progress? And so that's where these two trajectories take place. So you can see this dotted line that branches off is what a student's trajectory would look like if they did not get enrolled in the special education program. And then the anticipated outcome is that if they were enrolled in the program, that's where this box is, that they will have a more profound impact, or they will have a more profound performance in school than those who did not. And so that's what this program effect is measuring right here. And so this is what we are seeking to set up if we want to be able to say, yes, Lower Merion does have an impact on the academic success of its students. Does that make sense? All right, so let's add to this a little bit. There are two main requirements for creating a causal relationship. Number one is the evaluation design. That's what we're talking about tonight. And there are two main buckets for evaluation design, and that's experimental and quasi-experimental. And then the second one are statistically significant findings. So we're going to set up an evaluation design that is solid and is a solid evaluation design. And then when we collect our data and we do our analysis, at the end, we're looking for a statistically significant finding. And so when we have both of those things together, a solid evaluation design and positive statistically significant findings, we can say Lower Merion had an impact on a child's academic success. And really, that's what we're covering in these next 7 classes. Again, today we're talking more about evaluation design and how you set up that solid design. And then the last 5 classes will be, how do we do these statistical analyses so that we can prove that there was a causal relationship in whatever evaluation you set out to implement. And then I would finally say, and I of course am slanted towards quantitative, but I think that a third really strong ingredient is that qualitative data. And that helps to give the color to our story. It explains the hows and the whys to the findings that we have from the quantitative analysis. And so I would always argue that a mixed methods approach is the most effective, which is why we teach these two back to back. They're really important, the qualitative and the quantitative. So when it comes to experimental evaluation design, there are 2 types. The first one is experimental. That's the ideal design. And what it does is it uses random assignment and it assigns people into a case group, which is the group that's being evaluated, that was enrolled in the program that's being evaluated, and a control group. And that's the group that was not a participant in the program. And then it uses random sampling. So let me explain a little bit more. This design is typically called a randomized controlled trial, if you've heard of that, or an RCT. If you heard that phrase, that's what they're referring to. It's an experimental research design. It's used very frequently in medicine, as often as it can while it's still ethically okay. And what it does, again, is randomly assigns participants into 2 or more groups via a variety of assignment methods. And it is the gold standard of research design. A lot of folks, especially those in the medical field, consider anything that's not an RCT to not be good research and the findings to not be valid. They think it's RCT or bust. I would argue that's not the case, and that you really can find very solid findings using quasi-experimental designs, but it's worth understanding, it's worth knowing that that is not as respected in certain areas of the field. And so if you're more of a visual person, this is what RCTs look like in a flow chart. So we start with all of the potential participants. They're all screened as being appropriate for the program. And then their random assignment takes place. So some of them are assigned into a traditional program or no program at all. And then others are assigned into the experimental group or this new program. And then the outcomes are measured and they're compared. So when it comes to Lower Merion, you can see how we're getting into an ethics issue here. If we have all students who are qualified for special education and we wanted to do an evaluation of that special education program, this kind of design would require us to not put certain students in the special education program who need that special education in order to measure that difference. And so there has to be another way. And that's why we move into quasi-experimental. That's where this becomes relevant, is the ethics. When it is not ethically sound to use randomized assignment to do an experimental design. So it does not use randomized assignment. And it still has, though, a case group and a comparison group. And it still uses randomized sampling. And I'll get to sampling later, so you can just kind of like note it, but put it aside. Right now, what we're talking about is how they get assigned to the case group and the comparison group. So let me explain quasi-experimental, because there are a few ways that you can do this. I'll go over 3 of the main ones. The first one is called a cross-sectional study. And what this is used to determine the prevalence, or it infers causation. And what it does is it takes a whole group of people at one period of time, and then it inspects them and it looks retrospectively. So it looks back and we look at both the exposure and the outcome at the same time. So we really don't choose the group because for any reason besides they're a group of interest. And then we decide, okay, well, were they in special education or were they not? And how was their outcome? How were their test scores, for instance? Did they do well or did they not do well? And then we look for correlations between the 2 groups, who were in it and who were not in it. I'm using that example, but I wouldn't say that that's the best study for our evaluation. So, you know, it sounds a little awkward, but that's how that one works. Compared to that, case control. And so with a case control study, the evaluator chooses people who have the desired outcome. So they might look for a group of people who are all scored within the 80th or up percentile in their grade. And then once they have those people, they'll conduct interviews or record reviews to understand what the cause was. We're hoping that it was special education, but it might be something else. So we just explore these people and their experience in the education system to get a better understanding of why they were successful. And it does not follow people over time. This is completely retrospective also. And then what I would say is probably the most common one is a cohort study. And so I think this too, it's so common because it's really close to an RCT. And this is when people who are current program participants are compared with some other group. And these people are otherwise similar, it's just that they are not participating in the program. So really they're assigned themselves to a case and a control, but I wasn't the one who randomly assigned them as the evaluator who wants to understand the impact of the program. And this can be prospective, looking forward, or retrospective. So we can look backwards at the results, or we can look at the current groupings and then trace them over time to watch how things play out. Any questions about those three types or their difference with RCTs?
I have a question. So the main difference between the cohort study and the RCTs is that with the cohort study, participants are not randomly assigned.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to be.
There are many other ways that they get assigned, but it's not randomly for the purpose of the evaluation.
Would you mind giving a concrete example of the cross-sectional study, what that would look like in practice?
Yep. I think we could, trying to think of like a COVID case that might use that. I think that we could look at, I'm trying to think of a question, but this would be on a country level or a state level. So let's say we wanted to look at Italy and its experience with COVID. We would take the entire population, or maybe like Southern Italy's population now currently, and we would break it down to those who survived. The outcome would be survival or non-survival, and the exposure would be whether they were exposed to COVID or not. And we're completely looking backwards to understand, you know, how many people were exposed and survived, how many people were exposed and did not survive, and how many people were exposed but didn't come down with it, with COVID at all. So this is a way of just taking a whole population, breaking it down into its smaller parts, and looking for similarities and differences between the groups so that we could draw conclusions. Now, some conclusions that I would assume that we would draw from that would be people who socially distance had better outcomes. People who wore masks had better outcomes. People who were younger, right? All these things that we know about COVID could have been concluded if we did a cross-sectional study. It's just that that's not an appropriate design for something like COVID, because we need to know these answers way earlier than looking backwards after the fact. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks a lot.
Okay, good. Okay, so moving on to this idea of matching. So when we're doing a quasi-experimental design, we're breaking these groups up, or we're looking at these groups, the case and the control. And because it's not randomly designed, we need to engage in this thing called matching. And that's really just looking for the commonalities between the two groups to make sure that they are pretty much equivalent. And so the way that we do this is by matching. And this is done sometimes using observable characteristics. It assumes that the unobservable characteristics do not cause bias between the two groups. And the purpose is to find a comparison group that's very similar to the original group or the intervention group. And there are two main types of matching. The first one is exact matching. So for each participant, at least one non-participant who is identical to them is in the non-intervention group. And then it's really hard to do because of these unobservable characteristics. So that's, I would think, really a really simple and easy way to make the case that I've matched well is that I have one person who was in the special education program and the same person with the exact same disabilities, the same grades, the same temperament, the same parents, the same household, siblings, everything is the same about them, same demographics. yet they're just not in special education for whatever reason. That's exact matching. But that's, as you can see from that example, really hard to do. So there's an alternative. This is a statistical technique. I mean, this is, people write papers on this. It's complicated, but the concept that I want you to understand is that it's an alternative. It's called propensity score matching. And this is where non-participants, we choose specific characteristics that the participants have, and we look to create almost like a weighted amount in the non-participants, so that we can say they're just about equal. Even though there's not a one-to-one match, the weight of the two groups based on the factors that are important for this study are the same. So for instance, we would definitely be looking at special needs when it comes to the two groups and doing a propensity score match. We understand that demographics play such a huge role when it comes to socioeconomic status, race, gender. So those really should be considered when it comes to propensity score matching as well. Things like hair color and height, the number of siblings, probably not as important when it comes to making sure that we have a match. So that's the difference between those two. And again, just raise your hand or jump in if you have any questions. So when it comes to matching, there are a number of ways to identify this comparison group. And some examples include applicants that are not accepted. So if this is a program that has a certain number of slots, not everybody can be accepted. Those applicants that were not accepted make a really great comparison group. If there's a waiting list, similarly, that's very similar, that would make a really good comparison group. A lot of times you'll see this third bullet that there's a neighboring village, a neighboring school, a borough that's similar to it. You can use them as the comparison group. So I would recommend that we do that in Lower Merion. You could argue something else, but I would think that it would be helpful to look at a school district that's similar, maybe around Philadelphia, hopefully around Philadelphia, but for sure a suburb of a major city, and use their group of special education students and compare the two. There's no issue around who got special education and who didn't, but they all needed it. We know everybody got special education treatment. It's just the quality of education that we're looking at now. And then similarly, you can look at a previous group of participants and compare them to current and do that matching as well. It really just depends on what design makes the most sense for the program that you're trying to evaluate. There's no one that's better than the other. It's only better than the other when it comes to the question that you're asking and the population you're looking at. So this is, you know, for those of you who are visual, the hot mess that is quasi-experimental design. You can see why it's less desired just visually. It's far more confusing, but you know, this works for some people. I'm one of those people. But we have the new clients who enter the system. We have the pool of potential clients who could be a part of the program. And then we have this pool of potential matches who are not in the program for whatever reason. And we might separate them out from the very beginning and see those two as very different groups. And then we go through the matching process. And then we have our control group and our experimental group. Another way that this could take place is that we have the pool of potential clients, and then the selection process takes place. Who is part of the program and who is not. So this is like the waitlist group. And this is like if some people get in and some people don't, and they never have a chance of getting in. So that's the selection process. And then they would get sent to the pool of potential matches from which we can do our matching. And then from there, we have our outcome measures for both groups, and we compare the two. And you can see just from this convoluted look why this is less desired, while it's often seen as less rigorous in terms of its design, but sometimes it is just necessary. It is what needs to be done. And again, I would argue that the conclusions that come from it are just as rigorous as those that come from an RCT. So I want to give you a moment. Maybe we could do it together instead of going off into breakout rooms, because I'm aware of time. So going back to Lower Merion, which research design makes the most sense? I guess I've already given that answer away, but somebody shout it out. What makes more sense? Experimental, quasi-experimental? And just tell me why.
I think certainly quasi-experimental. So, and I also have a question, if you compare it with another district, what you said, that could be one possibility for the Marian, but then you would actually compare two education systems, and one is better and the other one is worse. Is that not also a little bit a problem of ethical?
Yeah, yes, it is. You would probably, so yes, if I was going through that, talking out loud, one thing I might do is look at multiple special education programs that are a comparison, like so I have multiple comparison groups. I would definitely de-identify. So I would never tell Lower Merion which school districts I was looking at and provide, yeah, names of participants for sure, but definitely not of the district either. Because you're right, that's not professional. Okay, good. So quasi-experimental, right? And then if quasi, is this a cohort, case control, or cross-sectional? And I'll just go back to the list. Which one do you think would make the most sense for this evaluation?
Cohort?
Yeah, I think so too. I think so too. And we could do it prospective or retrospective. I don't know if there's a difference between the two. I always like doing prospective if possible, but retrospective for sure if we want to look at them over years of academics, right? Prospective if we have maybe a year that they just want us to be looking at the students. So it would just depend. And then we talked about why. Okay, so moving on. Both experimental and quasi-experimental research design usually requires random sampling. So that was the bullet that I told you put aside for right now. We'll come back to it. We're here. We're at the sampling. So just a note about sampling and what it is, why it's important, and why most of the time it's what we need to do. So when we're looking at the group, we have the whole population and we could have potentially a sample. So talking about Lower Merion, the population is all special ed students from K to 12. And so that's the group. It contains every member you want to study. Sometimes the population is small enough that it's very doable. Our budget is large enough and we can do it. And that data is called census data. And so that should ring a bell for our Americans, and I imagine other countries have their regular census too, whether it's annual, biannual, every 5 years, whatever it may be. But that's what that means. Census is the whole population, or at least that's the goal. We all know that our census, at least in America, does not capture every single person. And then we compare this to a sample. Our census is definitely not a sample, and here's why. The sample is a group that's a smaller subset of the population. And this is because most of the times the population is much too large or the budget is too small to be able to collect data on every single person in the population. And so that data collection is called a survey. So that's where the two definitions come from. That was news to me. I'd always used the term census, I'd always used the term survey correctly, but didn't understand this greater context. And then I'll throw this in there and we're going to come back to it in session 4, so don't panic, but it's because of the central limit theorem that a properly drawn sample is considered representative of the population. So this is a statistical concept. It's because of the central limit theorem. It's this really cool finding that statisticians made that enables us to draw a sample. If we do it properly, we can analyze the sample and make conclusions that are sound about the population. So again, we'll come back to this in session 4. And so most of the time, population is not reasonable. So I want to just dive into sampling techniques and what's strong and what's weak, because this is really important. This will make or break a study. So when we're talking about the target population, again, for my visual friends, we've got the target population, that's this lime green. And then within the target population is the sampling frame. And those are all the people in the target population that we can actually have access to. So sometimes, you know, because of attrition, because of whatever it may be, the people that we actually can pull into our study is smaller than the actual target population. And so that's called the sampling frame. Sometimes it's the same size, but if not, and you hear people talking about a sampling frame, that's what that is. So then the sampling frame is where we pull our sample from. Every person in the sample comes from that sampling frame. And then it just exists on its own. So those are 3 different concepts that are worth knowing. So when it comes to types of sampling, there's probability-based sampling. And as you can see, this is the ideal. This is what you need to do in order to have a solid design. So it comes by many names: probability-based sampling, random sampling, and probability sampling. And this is when respondents are selected using a randomized method. The probability with which every member of the target population could have been selected in the sample is known. So this is different than the people randomly assigning them to a case group or a control group, right? We already have them in their groups. And this is how we're pulling the sample from that population to analyze. So this is, you are able to do this randomly, and you need to do this randomly. This one has to be done this way, because the alternative is non-probability sampling. It's also called convenience sampling. And this is when we can't determine what made one person go from one to be in the sample or not. So it's left up to chance. I didn't randomly and statistically choose them. It was left up to chance. I'm going to explain what I mean, what the difference is between these. And there are lots of examples. So when it comes to probability-based sampling, the most simple is SRS, simple random sampling. And this is when every individual in the target population has the possibility of being selected. So this could be like, you know, drawing names from a hat. Everybody has one ticket in the hat, and they're all the same size. They all the same paper. They have the same weight. They're cut the same way. And that is simple random sampling. And then I choose 20 or 30 or 50 or whatever it is that I determined I want my sample to be. Next is stratified random sampling. And this is useful when a population has several homogeneous groups. And so the evaluator first stratifies the population into those homogeneous groups, and then uses SRS to draw the samples from each of the groups. So for example, if we're talking about a group, Lower Merion I could speak to, it is a suburb of Philadelphia. It is predominantly white. And so it would be really important to know and understand if the experience of special education is different for different races or ethnicities. If I were just randomly choosing names out of the hat, it's possible that I could pull all white children for my sample. And so someone who really understands that they need to have this perspective on different races and ethnicities would go for something called the stratified random sampling. So what they do is split the sample, or I'm sorry, the population into these different groups, and then randomly selects from each of them, just to make sure that there's an equal not an equal representation, but all groups are represented. Next is cluster sampling. It's similar, but this is when the population is already broken into groups. And so now, again, we're interested in making sure it's representative. And we are looking at those already broken into groups and pulling people from each of them. For Lower Merion, a good example of this would be grade. So making sure that we have at least some representation from kindergarten straight through 12th grade, or maybe each elementary school, each middle school, and the high school. And then systematic sampling is the last one. And it's a process by which every 7th or every 10th participant is selected. So it's similar to simple random sampling, but not quite. Good. Okay. So then these I'm sharing with you, not because I want you to do them, but to be aware that they, one, they exist. And then two, as like a caution, like don't do this unless you have to. The first one is quota sampling. This is where the researcher has quotas that they want to meet. And so with that, the selection of respondents is left up to the survey interviewers who must match the quotas. So I would go, let's say we're administering surveys about experience in their special education program. And I have 10 people who are administering the surveys, and I tell them you need to make sure you get 2 kindergartners, 4 first graders, 10 eighth graders, and then 12 students in the high school. I don't care what grade they're in, and just leave it up to them to figure out the rest of the details. That's not random, right? That's left to a lot of interpretation and just convenience really for the individual surveyor. Next is snowball sampling. So anyway, my point to that is you choose, you know all of that information, you select the names, and you tell the surveyor exactly who they're surveying. That's how you move from non-probability to probability. Next is snowball sampling. This is a technique that is for sure used with certain populations, and sometimes it's just necessary. One example that I can think of where it's used, and I can't think of a better way, is with intervention programs for women or men who are being sex trafficked. And so it's very often, or work even in the sex industry. And because there's so much shame around it, because they could be thrown in jail because of it, very often snowball sampling is used when finding participants to even participate in this study. I guess this is a better example for research than evaluation. You would already know, hopefully, who they are if they're receiving services. But what the snowball sampling is you find 1 or 2 people who fit those who you want to research, and then you ask them to put you in touch with 2 or 3 other people. And so we're branching out and we're slowly getting to the number of people that we want to survey. But I don't know all of them from the beginning to make sure that it's random. It's just the snowball effect. And then last is judgment sampling. And this is when the evaluator selects the type of individual that will make up the sample because they decided that that group is representative. So for example, Netflix users, when the target population is all streaming platforms. So if we wanted to decide, you know, the popularity of all video streaming platforms, and I decide, well, it's easier and I know people who work at Netflix, so we're going to work with Netflix, and then think that I can generalize my findings about Netflix with Hulu, with YouTube TV, and so on. So the difference between these two, I'm going to dive into a little bit more, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. It's a lot of information, I'm aware of that. It's just kind of like, let what can sink in, and obviously you have the link to this to go back to when you need it. All right, so just a really small note, you know, we were talking about sample size, but how do we determine that? You'll often hear things like the sample must be sufficiently sized in order for it to be representative, or if you haven't heard that, know that that's the case. It has to be a large enough sample to be representative. And the larger the sample size, the more representative it is. Both of those statements are true. But how many people is sufficiently large? That's always a question that people have. And so you could figure it out by hand. This is this formula for figuring it out. Or you could just use a calculator. I found a really great one online. Here's a link to it. I can show you really quickly what it looks like. But what it allows you to do is to put in your population size. So how many people are in the total population? What do you want your margin of error and confidence level to be? Usually, I would recommend just putting margin of error at 5, confidence level at 95. That's the general go-to in the research and evaluation community. And then it will spit out how many people you need. So let's say our population size of special education students in Lower Merion is 10,000. At a 5% margin of error, 95% confidence level, we need to make sure that we have 370 participants in the sample population in order to make any generalization about all of the students, the special needs students at Lower Merion. It's as simple as that. You're welcome. It took a little while to find. And you don't have to do this. So that's there. And I do ask a homework question that includes that. So keep note of that. So when it comes to the sample size, if you're not sure how large your sample is, or if you want to stratify and you're not sure how large your subgroups need to be in your sample, there's open data. I could teach a whole class on this too, but here are some links. If you're looking at a global population, here are some links to general demographic information. If we're looking at America in particular, here's some national. I should have said that. I'm very American-centric of me. And then if you want to look at New York specifically, if that's your population, you can pull up any of these. So any of these links will take you to all sorts of data. And again, it'll help you with total population information as well as stratification if you want to stratify by any demographics. There's that. Okay, so then check time. Let's do this as a group too. So if we're talking about Lower Merion again, and we're talking about sampling, what sampling method makes the most sense? We want to do probability based, and I think we could. And I think you could argue for a number of these. Tell me which one do you think would make sense, and tell me why.
So I think cluster sampling would make sense, just because you want to touch on different schools across the district.
Yep.
You know, and see if there's any sort of variation in terms of the different how the service is being provided to the different through those different schools, even though it's supposed to be a overall program.
Yep, I completely agree. I think you would be remiss if you didn't make sure that every school was represented in some way. And you're right that that's cluster sampling. Perfect.
Just have a very quick question here. For example, when you look at the stratified random sampling, when you do it by race and ethnicity, for example, you only have 10% black, but 90% white. So you then also need to make the groups, the samples 10 and 90%, because otherwise you cannot do it 50-50. Yeah. Okay.
That is correct. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yep. And that is a perfect example, with why we might use stratified random sampling. And you can use a combination, and I would actually recommend doing a combination of the two. Like sitting here and I'm thinking, I'm sure the school is wondering how their services play out across the different schools. I'm sure you would not need to convince them to do cluster sampling. I would hope that they too would be interested in how different subgroups in their schools, whether it be socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender. But there's a lot of ways you can break down the demographics of the students. So when it comes to this, you might want to ask, the folks what comes to mind as being something that you struggle with or something you're curious about, and that could help you to figure out what stratifying that you do. Okay, so that's sampling. And then just in general, things to be wary of. So before I get into that, what I will say is that if you wind up using a sampling method that's not randomized, if you wind up, actually, I would just say that it's okay. It's not ideal, but sometimes, as I said, it's necessary. And if that's the case, the way that we account for that is just in the write-up of the evaluation. There's always a limitations section. And that's where you explain and you're honest about what you did and why, the methodology section and the limitation section. And so I mention that because There are also factors that corrupt an evaluation. And while it's important to know of them so that we can defend against those corruptions, sometimes it's unavoidable. And so similarly, if during the evaluation you come to understand that there are corrupting factors, it's just important to have that section of your report that is truthful and honest about what those corrupting factors are. So in terms of what some of them are, what they are is that they threaten your ability to generalize to your target population. So they threaten the integrity of your research design. And they can be guarded against. And as I said, when it's unavoidable, you acknowledge it as a limitation. And we've talked about some of them. So research design, some folks would say that using quasi-experimental is a corrupting influence. Depending on how you design it, it's more vulnerable to corrupting influences. Let's say that. Sampling method, we talked about that. Sample size is another one. If you have your target in mind, the 370 or whatever it was, but you don't reach that target sample size, that's a corrupting influence. It makes it harder to generalize to the population. So here are some others. I'll put them into two buckets too. They're sampling factors and they're contextual factors. And those are the 7, and I'll talk about each of them. But starting with sampling factors, there's selection bias. And so that's any method to select participants that makes them different from non-participants. So any method to select participants that makes them different from non-participants. Trying to think of a good example of that. Oh, here we go. It's when we select students most likely to succeed for a college prep program. So, colleges do that all the time, right? Where we look at all of the students who could participate in the college and we choose the ones who have the best grades, the best, most extracurriculars, just the highest achieving. And then that college at the end of the day can say they have a fabulous graduation rate. And of course they do, because they chose the best of the best to participate in their college. Similarly, we could do something like that with an evaluation, and it's important to make sure that we don't. Similar to that is self-selection bias, and that's when people choose to participate or not participate, whether it's in the program or in the evaluation. And that can make it very difficult to measure the integrity of the program. Next is a site selection bias. This is strictly when it comes to our evaluation design, and that's choosing a program or site that's going to show the best results, right? So in the 7 schools that Lower Merion has in their school district, there are 4 elementary schools, and we choose the 2 that always wind up with the strongest scores for special needs students. Of course, we're going to find that it has a really good outcome if that's the case. We want to make sure that we're not incorporating site selection bias here. Next is attrition. This one's hard to guard against, and that's just when the strength of an evaluation gradually decreases as a result of participant dropout. So when we are talking about whether you do a prospective evaluation or a retrospective, in a lot of ways, retrospective is useful in guarding against attrition because people were in or they were not, and we're looking backwards. If we're doing prospective, if we're moving along time with our participants in the evaluation, attrition is a thing. The way I would say that you guard against that is making sure your sample size is even larger than you need it to be, so that people who fall out don't affect your sample size. Now, we don't know why they're falling out of the evaluation, and that too could be a corrupting factor, but you just need then to understand, maybe have an exit interview for the people who are leaving the evaluation to understand why, or if people are moving out of the district, if people are leaving special education, just get an understanding of why. Okay, and then when it comes to the contextual factors, there's participant maturation. And we talked about this a little bit, where if we're doing, excuse me, a prospective study of our students at Lower Merion, but we're doing it over the course of 5 years, of course they're going to grow. Of course they're going to show good results. And so the question is, what is attributed to the intervention and what is just attributed to time? And the example here is a reading program for first graders. Of course, they're going to improve in their reading. It's just how much? Next is intervening events. And my God, how the evaluation community has just gone into a tailspin with COVID. Everything has changed, especially those who had a set design before COVID, and now they had to completely change it because of the lack of ability to be in person and collect this data. That's huge in terms of integrity and consistency with how we're collecting information. And people are struggling with how do I responsibly draw conclusions when some of these things were done in person and some were done virtually. It's a really hard question. And it's a case-by-case basis to decide how you compensate for that. But that's a dramatic example of an intervening event. Other examples are economic downturn, a conflict in the area, a natural disaster, changes in government leadership. Next is spillover or contamination. That's when members of the control group are affected by the program or service that's being evaluated. The control group is the group that did not participate, but they're still being impacted. There are two common reasons for why this would happen. One, program participants share what they learned with those who are not participating. So a family member, I saw this happening when I was evaluating a health intervention program. It was health education. And so you teach one family member, but they're going to go home and teach their family what they learned about brushing their teeth or washing their hands or whatever it may be. And so now suddenly, if I was using the other family members as my control, they're now contaminated. And the second way is that the treatment and control group members change groups. So when we were talking about people who are in the group and maybe on the wait list, and then we accidentally pull in people who are on the wait list into the group later on. So just that movement, you need to make sure the groups are separate and they stay separate, or you don't include them. Okay. I see that it's 9:15. We have about 15 more minutes. I have a couple of things that we could do. I could put you into your small breakout groups and have you practice this. So I have you'll come up with your own case study, like your own program that you want to create a fake evaluation for and go through those questions again. And we could do that for, I'd say even 10 minutes, which could give you enough time to practice some of these concepts. Another alternative is that I could just go over kind of NYU classes, go over your homework assignment with you, and then let those of you who want to go, and I could answer questions that the rest of you may have. And I guess maybe let's talk about it in the chat box. Let me know, which option you prefer. If you want to go into breakout groups, that's option number 1. Or if you'd prefer to just go over the homework and go. And that's group 2 or option 2. Okay. Okay. I'm seeing a lot of 2s. For those of you who wanted practice, I'll stay after we release everybody else and we can go through that together. Okay, so when it comes to homework, one thing that I just want to say, all of my slides are online. They are in perpetuity. You can see the link. This follows its own order. So this is class number 1. That last number is a number 1. If you want to get a preview of next class, just change that number to a 2, and there are the slides for next class. Similarly, with the format of my classes are the same. And so when it comes to the final slides, there's the homework review. You'll always find a link here to your homework. You'll also find it in NYU classes, and that's where you submit it. So I'm going to show you the homework now, and then we'll go into NYU classes and just take a look at that. We meet again on Tuesday at 6:30. And so I just ask, I try to give you as long as you can to do the homework. I ask that by Monday at midnight that you complete it. I can't do 11:59 in NYU classes, so it's 11:55 at night on Monday. Please submit it. I'll go through them on Tuesday before class to just see how everybody's doing. I'll grade it later. So that's that. And then there are readings as well. So just to take a quick look at our homework. So this is the format of it. What I do, as I shared with you earlier, is talk about concepts in class, give you an opportunity to practice as a whole class. If I was better timed, you would have time to practice in small groups, and then you would do the exact same thing for homework. And that's the design I'm using here. So my challenge for you is to think of a program or service your organization provides that you would be interested in evaluating. If you're not currently working, go with an old organization that you used to work for. Think of any program or service. If this isn't working for you, maybe think of a program or service that you participate in. And then I have the questions outlined to answer. And these are broken down just the way that we did it as a big group. So 1, what is the program or service? Who is the target population of that program or service? What are the program activities? What's the intended impact? And what's your evaluation question? And then next, which research design makes the most sense? And that's a 2-part question, experimental or quasi, and if quasi, which type? And then the why, that one's really important. And then next is sampling method and sample size. So what sampling method makes the most sense? And again, don't forget that why. I grade that part heavily. And then how large is the target population? Again, you just go to that calculator online and figure that out. And, or I'm sorry, the target population, if you don't know it, use open data, or if you can't use open data, estimate it. And then what is your ideal sample size? That's with the sample size calculator that's online. And then there are a couple of other questions to answer. Number 1, explain the main similarities between research and evaluation in 42 words or less. No rhyme or reason for 42, just because that's what it is. And then 2, or next, find an example of 2 of the 4 main types of evaluation. Provide a link or upload a copy. And what are the questions the evaluation attempts to answer? You can find these online if you don't have access or you haven't participated in any evaluations. There are for sure evaluations online. Just do a search, UN evaluations, and you can pull up hundreds of them. So just pick 2 and make sure they're from different types of evaluation. And then on the second page, we have the readings. And so, you know, I understand that you're limited in time. We're all out doing other things besides just, you know, going to school. So these all are helpful readings, but it's a lot. And so I've had previous classes ask me to narrow down and really focus in on what's the most important. So that's the required readings. And then the additional resources are just there if you want to learn more, if you ever want to go back and look, that's there for you. So there's 4 pieces. Number 1 is New York City's Family Enrichment Center's evaluation plan. This is a plan for an evaluation, not an actual evaluation report. We'll be referring to that kind of the way that we did with Lower Merion today. There's Whelan, and I will tell you what chapter that is. I just need to go find it. Then we have an article in this, actually these last 2 are articles. Those you'll find in NYU classes, or I'm sorry, in the NYU library. So if you're not sure how to search for that, again, I'll record something. I'll email you when it's up on NYU classes. It'll be in the resources section. So I'm going to stop because I see chat box. Okay, that's just for option 2. All right, great. So any questions about this before I go to NYU classes and just show you really quickly that orientation?
Sorry. He's going. I was going to say that I was a little bit confused. I thought there was actually an assignment before the class, and I'm not sure if it was because of one of the syllabuses that I had read had it written in a way where there was, or was there an assignment to be done before this class?
No, the only thing that you had to do was the pre-readings. So
Okay.
Here's the syllabus.
Okay.
Oh, here's the syllabus. So for session 1, the required readings for class were to be done before class. And if you didn't, that's okay, just do them now. And then you'll see that there's exercise 1, and that's the homework. It is a little confusing. So
yeah, so I think I had read that as, oh, there's pre-readings and there's an assignment. So I was looking for an assignment.
I'll make a note to myself to make that more clear. Okay. And then just so you know, because it does get a little confusing, exercise 1, these required readings for next class are these same readings. So at this point, you don't really need the syllabus. You can use this homework assignment as your guide through what the required readings and the work is that needs to be done. Any other questions?
Quick question on the homework, just kind of thinking through on the sample size calculation. If we're using, for example, we're recommending a stratified sample, do we then take the sample of the stratification and put that into the calculator?
Yes.
And then collectively it would be the sum of all those? Okay, clear.
Exactly. Anybody else?
Yes, sorry, just a quick question also on for the homework, for the definition of the program or service. Can it also be a program or service that we provide internal to our organization?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And also, I believe you mentioned you were going to show us in the library where to find some of the readings.
Yes. So what I'll do, maybe tonight, if not tomorrow, I'll just record a really quick tutorial. I can also show you after this. We'll have a couple minutes and just show you live how to search for it.
Sure.
And then when we get to NYU classes, let me just view this as a student. So here's the main page, the landing page when you get there. I mean, this should be relatively familiar to you. I don't use it all that much, only a couple of tabs in here. The assignments for sure I use. So these assignments will appear when class begins. So session 1 began and the homework appeared. So the other assignments won't show up until it's time. There's no real need for you to click into it before the end of class anyway. But you can see the assignment is in progress, the instructions, you can download a copy of the homework here. This link is what I just showed you. So it's exactly the same. The big thing, the reason I'm showing this to you is this is where you're going to attach the homework. You'll upload it here. I believe I made it so that you can upload multiple files because you'll need to do that periodically throughout. Actually, this one, you'll need to upload the homework, your answers to the homework, and you'll need to upload the 2 evaluations that you find. So if you find that you're having trouble, you can only upload 1 file, just shoot me an email and I'll change the permissions. I think it's fine though. And then the resources.
Sorry, which 2 evaluations are you referring to here?
Here in the other questions to answer. So number 12, find an example of 2 of the 4 main types of evaluation. So you'll just upload that report. The resources section is the other one that I use frequently. So what I'll do is at the end of this class, I'll upload this recording. I'll put it on probably a YouTube and I'll put the YouTube link here. So if you ever want to go back to the actual lecture, you can find the video here. This is also where I'll put the tutorial on using NYU libraries. So really assignments and resources where you want to go.
Very quick question. The format, does it need to be a Google Doc or can it also be MS Word, or does it make a difference for you, or?
Nope, no difference.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Feel free to ask questions. Like I put the slides up there so that they are there to go back to. I try to just give as many supports as I can as we go through this. But if anything is at all confusing, please feel free to reach out. I guess I just have one other question. I'm on Slack, and I'm more than happy to set up a Slack group for this class, if that's helpful.
Sorry,
I know sometimes. Sorry.
Sorry, what is Slack? I'm not familiar with Slack.
It's like an instant messaging platform. And so I know I wasn't sure if other teachers before me used it. I do think that the qualitative professor will, but it just provides an opportunity for all of us to interact, ask questions and answer them. So instead of maybe emailing me a question, you could send it in Slack and then everybody can see the answer, because oftentimes when one person has a question, multiple people do. So if you're interested in that, I could, sorry, say it again.
I said I'm personally very interested in that idea.
Okay. How about this? I will send each of you an invite. I believe I have all of your email addresses. I'll find it in the system. I'll send you an invite to Slack. If you want to join us over there. If you don't. I can show you really quickly what it looks like. Let me open it up. I don't have a former class, unfortunately, but I can just show you a different Slack group that I'm in. Here we go. Okay, so this is what Slack looks like. And actually, I can invite you to this too. It's a evaluation community group. But when you're a part of it, there are different channels. I probably won't make that very complicated. I might just have one channel and that'll just be our group. But when you click into it, you can see that, you know, people are writing to each other in here. It shows you questions over time. You know, in the general tab, you know, Nick just made a comment. He shared a resource with us. And then, you know, people can like it, they can react to it. If I wanted to reply specifically to him, I could do so, you know, with this reply in thread, and then we can have our own thread going. It's a chat group, essentially. I do think it could be helpful when asking questions. So again, if you want to join, feel free to accept the invite. And if you need a tutorial in Slack, I can do that too. I see, yeah, I see people saying yes to Slack. Okay, great. So I will do that for sure. Anything else? I can't think of anything, any other questions before we part ways? Oh, look at that, it's 9:31. All right, I'm going to stop recording.